So we're just going to look at a couple selected questions from these. The first one is number 2 on this list. What are the advantages and disadvantages of using the word secular to describe ourselves? And what about the word humanistic? And are there other terms that might work? So what are some of the advantages if you chose to call yourself a secular Jew or chose to call your group a secular Jewish community?
Everybody looks at me. Well, to me, secular is it's amoral, in a sense.
Is that a positive or a negative?
It's a negative, I think.
Okay.
Because I think you can be a curmudgeon secular person that's just mean and does a lot of nasty things, but you can still be secular. And so secular by itself doesn't imply a moral system that I would like to see as part of the community that I belong to.
Okay.
So, if you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, sure.
You know, I mean, secularism by itself doesn't imply any particular moral system. It doesn't also negate it. You know, it's like capitalism. Capitalism can exist in authoritarian situations, or it can exist in democratic situations.
Right.
It by itself, it doesn't connote one or the other. And
okay.
I think that's secularism.
For me, it's important because it states my agnosticism. When I'm in the UU Church, I'm surrounded by partial believers,
right.
and I feel isolated because of that. So secular is something I hold on to.
It clarifies things. In fact, one of the reasons why the International Federation called itself the International Federation of Secular Humanistic Jews, as opposed to secular and humanistic Jews, was they wanted to clarify, we don't want no religious humanists in here. Because you could be believing in a God, but a God that wants people to do things.
Yeah,
you're a religious
I agree.
humanist.
Yeah, I mean, I see how that, and I don't disagree with what you're saying. I'm just saying that it just like using the term secular by itself can be also just sort of
right.
Yeah, well, it's amoral. It's all being
yeah.
But I've learned humanism. I'm finding out more here how much of it I did learn in a home where one person was an atheist and the other person was very religious. But they had the same ideas of the world and who should...
How to be a good person.
And that you shouldn't depend on God to do things for you. You should do it yourself. And, all that kind of stuff. And I'm finding almost a lot of stuff very familiar except for the Jewish part, which I just don't have a background in.
Right.
So it's... I don't know if that means anything, but...
No, but that's very, I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, I know her parents very well. I mean, we were married a long time. And it's true, her dad was kind of like, I don't care about anything. And her mom was like well, she was brought up a Catholic. And she became Protestant when she got married. But she was very, at the end, when she was dying, she wanted the pastor there. She wanted communion, and this was comfortable for her.
Right.
But her basic ideas... We used to have these long discussions over counterpoint at night when everybody else was asleep, and Louise and I would talk until 11 o'clock at night about stuff. And we come from totally different backgrounds, and yet we basically agreed on most things, which is interesting.
Well, I mean, that's where sometimes these lines that we draw are not as bright and high as we think. So, some advantages to using secular is that you're clearly defining yourself as not religious. So if you ask people, are you a religious person? I mean, it's funny, you come to a weekly study session with a rabbi. People might assume you're religious. But the content of what's happening is very different. My dad used to go to a Bible study class at Birmingham Temple, and he loved it because his friends knew what an atheist he was. But I said, I'm going to Bible class on Saturday morning. So people don't quite get it. If you called it secular, then maybe they'd get it a little bit more because they think they know what religious means. Also, it does create the intrigue, the paradox of a secular rabbi or a secular Jewish community. Like, what does that mean? That's interesting. I thought that was an oxymoron. Explain a bit more to it. And for many people, secularism also has the concept of individual freedom included in it, right? That you get to make up your own mind. It's you're free.
Yeah.
There's an interesting discussion in an Israeli author's book about the difference he describes between rabbanut, which is the rabbinate, and ribonut, which is self-autonomy, self-determination. And he sees them as in opposition to each other. That if you're secular, then you are a self-determining Jew, you are a free Jew to make your own choices, But if you're a religious Jew, you're under the authority of a rabbi who's going to tell you what to do. And so the secular for them is a freeing experience. He also tries to make connections between the word for secular in Hebrew is chiloni, and chalon is a window. And so the idea that you can sort of see through it or pass through it, or he's trying to draw that connection. Now, secular, as we know, can be seen as a negative term. It's sometimes defining yourself by what you're not, as opposed to what you are. It does make it harder to get on the Jewish religious leaders panel if you insist on being secular. Because people see secular as an opposition. The idea of a secular religion is not just an oxymoron to them, it's just moronic. I mean, they don't accept it as a paradox, they just see it as nonsensical.
You go through that all the time.
Right.
Are we a church or not?
Right, exactly. Another example of a negative is that if you are trying to appeal to secular individuals to join a community, they tend to be the people least likely to want to join anything. They self-define as non-institutional. I don't go to church. I don't go to the institution. I don't go anywhere that tells me what to do or what to think. That's part of their secularism. And so to get them to actually join something that actually does something, yes, they'd have more of a voice, but they'd also have to submit to some kind of institution. And there are often individuals who either don't want anything to do with it or came away from a communitarian, traditional religious community and want even less to do with anything that smacks of that background they left behind. The ex-religious person is sometimes even more anti-religious than somebody who's evolved out of it in a kind of liberal bourgeois way. Another feature that's a challenge is that sometimes secular is used as the opposite of Jewish. So people will say, well, is it on the Jewish calendar or the secular calendar? Or is this in Jewish literature or secular literature? And they mean universal literature, but if you're a secular Jew, how does that work if Jewish is the opposite of secular? Now, what are some of the advantages using humanistic? Well, as we said, it's a positive self-definition, right? It has a warm, fuzzy feeling to it too. It sounds like a positive thing. People often confuse it with humanitarian, but that's also part of it, having people as your concern, focusing on the human experience and human needs. And humanism might include being secular. For many people, being a humanist includes the philosophical secularism, the naturalism, the self-determination of people. Now, disadvantages with using the term humanistic? They might think you mean Renaissance humanism. What does that mean? It's a word that people aren't quite sure what it means, kind of like woke. So it takes on whatever meaning you want. I've had someone say, they want a free copy of a book, and I say, well, we have it for sale. And they say, well, that's not very humanistic of you to not just give it away. And I say, what does that mean? No. I want to keep the institution in business. Like, is that wrong?
I think sometimes people also think, like you say, Renaissance, but also, more open sexually and a whole lot of other, concepts like that, which they find negative.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Oral Roberts and the Moral Majority tried to demonize secular humanism, how terrible secular humanism was. And you do occasionally get people who say, well, all of Judaism is humanistic, in the sense, sort of like what Kathy was saying, that all of Judaism is talking about what people do and what people can do and how people should act. And it is true that there is a strand in Jewish ethics that talks about the obligations between a person and their fellow and how people act in the world. There's a whole strand in liberal Jewish theology called partnership theology, where God is rooting you on, but you're the one that has to act in the world. He gives you sort of guidelines and rules and says, and gives you encouragement, but in the end, that God can't intervene in the world. I call it the God as the cheerleader, who's on the sidelines going, go, go, go. Or the coach who draws up the plays for you, but they can't actually throw the ball or tackle the person. They can't get on the field and do things.
Unless you run plays.
That's very non-Torah, though.
Well, but that's exactly right. That there's plenty of language, liturgy, prayers, blessings, stories in the religious literature and the prayer book that talk about a God who intervenes on the field. God is a quarterback with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, who who calls all the plays and makes things happen on the field and carries you.
There are all those people that thank God when they hit a home run.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I love that.
But that's at least believing in a God consistent with what they're praying in synagogue or church. where this new postmodern theological God, I mean, it's fine if you believe in that, but it's not what you're saying. You know, you're talking to God, a king, you know, who does all these things. And so part of the problem when people say all of Judaism is humanistic, it's not true. Some of traditional Judaism is humanistic, for sure, but not all of it. You know, read the English translation of the prayer book sometime, and it'll be clear where we're different.
Well, I think there's a lot, you know, in Psalms and Proverbs about fearing God, you know, and God it's God-centric, you know.
Oh, sure.
You know, the advice in the Proverbs is, you know, son, do what God wants you to do, and everything will come out right. I mean, that's a lot of that, which is not human-centric.
Right, that's right. Okay, number 3. What are the advantages and disadvantages of a school community model versus a congregational model? So remember, you had these secular Jewish shulas that were primarily organized around school for youth versus the congregational model with a rabbi or with regular Shabbat services and holiday services and so on. What might be an advantage of the school model? Or we'll just talk about the school model in general, either positives or negatives.
I'm not sure I follow what you mean by the school model.
So imagine if the secular Jewish community were primarily organized around a school for kids.
Oh.
That's what it did. And, you know, they might have parent discussions on Sunday morning, but primarily what they're doing is providing an education for the kids, community for the kids, and life cycle events for the kids.
So it's a high school, sort of.
Well, like a elementary through middle school in most cases. Maybe some high school programming. I mean, most people who join Jewish communities join around that time period. Now, our community is a little bit different because we provide a full-service congregation, so we get plenty of older adults who join, or people who join without kids because they're getting their adult community needs met. But many congregations have people join when their kids are 8 years old or 9 years old, and then when the kid is 13 years and 1 day, they are out the door because the kid has had their bar mitzvah event, and the family's done. I mean, there have been people who like call up the temple office the Monday after the bar mitzvah was that weekend to quit and resign because they got what they wanted, and what they wanted was this life cycle event, and that's it. So if that's what people want, maybe you just give them what they want. Why make them pay for and support a full, you know, cradle to grave community when they don't want that? They just want a Jewish educational institution. I mean, there are a lot of people now that don't even join communities. They just hire a rabbi or another Jewish leader to train their kid for a bar mitzvah and do it freelance. They don't join anything. It's called the independent B mitzvah process, where you hire somebody, they train the kid, and you invite your friends, and that's it. You don't need to join anything.
So, what's the point of that? I mean, I don't understand what the point of it is.
It sounds very superficial.
So, I mean, okay, so I got my kid bar mitzvah, and now what? I mean, so what?
You fulfilled your responsibilities.
To whom?
To your grandparents.
So then you join your parents in doing nothing.
Right, we're done.
I could tell you about my first marriage to a Jewish family who hadn't done anything Jewish until I came along, and I had to be re-Jewished. But having a Jewish mother wasn't enough. I had to go through the conversion process.
Oh, really? Which is funny because it's even in an Orthodox definition, that's enough.
I know.
But it was...
Not these three rabbis.
Yeah. That's funny.
They had a great fun with me.
Wow.
So, I mean, the advantage of the school model is it's more affordable. People get, if what they want is just an education for the kid, that's what they get. And it's like other supplementary cultural schools that other religious groups run. You might have heard of Japanese families sending their kids to Japanese cultural school or Norwegian family. You know, they do it to learn some of their language and some of their culture. And so this would be a parallel to that for other people.
There used to be a Japanese school down the street from us, remember?
Right. And so they run it after school or supplementary, and it provides cultural education. Right. Like it'd be a Yiddish or Hebrew school in that model. I mean, the downside is that you're having a continual churn of people because once the kids are older, the parents are done, and now you got to get more people in where there's no reason for the families to stay members once the kids are done. The other problem is you run into this phenomenon that people call pediatric Judaism. One generation gets a 13-year-old's understanding of Jewish life, and then it's done. And then when they have kids, they send their kids only up to age 13 because that's when they got to quit. So they're going to let their kids quit at that age, and then, so nobody gets more than the 13-year-old understanding of what Jewish life is like.
Well, and at some point, I would think that if the kid only has that 13-year-old understanding, they may just not bother.
Right.
You know, I mean,
Exactly.
So like,
Exactly.
What's the point?
And also, you're sort of modeling to them, this is really not an adult activity.
Yeah.
You know, like, when I take my kids to see Barney the dinosaur on ice, they know I'm going for them. It's not for me. So if Jewish life is basically like the Lego store that you're going to outgrow, or, you know, the amusement park, or Kiddie Land or something, like, what's, you know, why bother? And so having adult involvement as a model is actually valuable for identity inculcation. I actually say to our Sunday school parents, your kids probably learn more on a Sunday morning if they see you staying for adult education than they learn in the classroom in that particular 2-hour block. Because you're demonstrating to them, this is interesting to me. This is valuable for me, even more than whatever content they might have gotten in that particular class session. Now, if you do have a full service congregation, you can create programming that's relevant and interesting for all ages, not just children and parents, but also young adults and empty nesters and seniors. It's a lot easier to get on the rabbi panel and the community panel and print it in the directory if you're a synagogue like the other synagogues. It does things like the other synagogues instead of just a cultural school. And being in a more formal congregational model enables trained leadership, professional staff, regular adult programming, that a volunteer-led school may be cheaper, but also doesn't have the infrastructure. Now the downside is it's more expensive, which can make it less affordable for people. Some people are opposed to organized religion in any form. I sometimes joke that we are unorganized religion.
Like the Democrats, we're unorganized.
Yeah, right. I don't belong to an organized political party. Even if we don't have the traditional content, people might still see rabbi synagogue service and say, I want nothing to do with that. You know, that's what I left behind. So that's a downside. And we have to keep in mind, you know, centralized leadership can be unresponsive, even dictatorial in running a community. You know, those anti-clerical impulses of the secular Jewish world weren't all mishuggah, right? They weren't all crazy. That there is something about a clergy position or, you know, formal leadership with paid dues and so on that creates its own structures, and power can corrupt.
Well, I will just make this observation after 3 or 4 years of being part of the community, is that your position is incredibly important. I mean, as the rabbi, you're sort of the leader of the group, and if you chose to be a jackass, you know, it would impact, I mean, how this community has formed and stayed has an awful lot to do with you, and I imagine with Friedman before, I don't know him, but as to how it's gone, and then the people who continue to be part of that community respond to that and act in a certain fashion because of that.
Yep.
If you were replaced by an egocentric, you know, whatever, rabbi who's I want to be right, even though it's in this kind of community, it could really tear things apart, I think. So that's leadership's extremely important here.
And I'll give you one example where I wanted less authority and they wouldn't take it. So when I first came here to Kol Hadash in 2004, I said, I think it'd be really helpful to have a liturgy committee that when I'm creating new services or thinking of bringing in new material, I could run things by them and, you know, get some feedback and input and whatever, because they know the tenor of the community more than I do, and they didn't want it. They said, you're the rabbi, we've subcontracted that out to you, like, you're in charge of that department, just do it. It's not only your job, it's your authority. You have authority to do what you want to do.
Don't give us that authority. I mean, don't give us that responsibility.
Right. We don't want it. We've been doing it for 3 years on our own, and it's too much, and we want you to just
I could definitely
take it
see why after that 3 years they might have done
right.
that. Yeah.
But I found a way to backdoor it in. So sometimes I'll come to the steering committee and say, here's an idea I had for a poem or reading that might work in a service. What do you think of this? And sometimes it pushes the envelope of what we've done historically, and, you know, asks questions in ways that might be ambiguously theological. And so I find it helpful to have just the discussion and feedback in that setting. I'll ask members of our community leadership to proof new high holiday services, ostensibly for typos, but also to give me some feedback on content and flow and so on. So I found ways to get the feedback that I want, but they didn't want to have direct authority over me in that way. They wanted me to have that autonomy and authority as a rabbi.
Sure.
So, this is one of those cases where sometimes people surrender their own freedoms because they don't want the hassle. And
well, they also figure they don't
happens.
know as much as you do. I mean, honestly, I couldn't create the sermons that you create.
And then that creates other problems. So one year I wrote an original poem in a high holiday service. We read it, everything went fine. The next year we're using that same service again. I'm reading through it just before I get up to read it. And I read a line that says, it's about how we create harmony out of diversity. And the line says, when red and blue color green. They don't.
No, they don't.
Red and blue make purple.
Yeah.
Yellow and blue make
Right.
green. But nobody caught it. I even missed it the first year, but that's understandable. You miss your own, typos in your own stuff.
Yeah.
But nobody, they must have assumed I was operating on some kind of deeper level, or this is some kind of profundity they didn't quite get, or whatever. No, it was just a typo. I just missed it. So that's where, again, the authority position can corrupt. But also, you need to keep encouraging people. No, it's not my Judaism. It's not my congregation. It's ours and yours. And so you want to, empower them to take that kind of ownership. But that's a particular style of rabbinate. Some are more, I'm in charge and this is what we do. And some are more empowering, and some are somewhere in the middle. I could make a living just getting guest speakers every week and just have different members of the congregation, because we have smart members who could talk on interesting topics, and then I'd just be the MC and hand it off to them. I could do more of that for sure, but I also think people are interested in what I have to say still, and until they get bored of that, then I'll keep talking.
I have a question about that, actually. So I've wondered about the readings that people do during the high holidays.
Yeah.
Do you choose the readings and then they decide what they want to do, or do they choose?
What we do is we ask everyone in the congregation, do you want to read?
Right.
If you want to read, which service can you attend? Once I know who can attend which services, I go through and assign who would be a good fit for which reading.
Okay. So it's not like Ron Schwartz is deciding he wants to do this particular reading.
That would be totally unworkable.
Well, that's
what if 6 people wanted the same reading and nobody wanted the other 4?
Yeah.
No, they tell me what service.
Yeah.
I try to find a good fit for the person and vocal style, whatever, and what the reading is, and I do my best.
Okay.
But I do open it up to everybody. Instead of inviting people, I just send an email out to the whole congregation and say, who wants to read? And I've never had too many people volunteer. Occasionally I even have to ask people or assign people to, because we don't get quite enough. But usually it works out. We get about the same number as we have readings in the services.
Interesting. Okay, I was just curious because I didn't know how that worked.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple last discussion questions. What are some areas on which secular humanistic Jews can agree to differ, and what are some of the philosophical boundaries of secular humanistic Judaism? So we can have a diversity of perspectives within one community on things like, what label for your God belief or disbelief do you use? Because we have agnostics, we have atheists, we have agnostics. Even a deist could fit here, who believed in a God before the beginning of the universe, but that doesn't intervene in the world, or doesn't write a Torah, doesn't care what you eat or who you marry.
The watchmaker.
Yeah. Now, if you do believe in a God who knows if you've been sleeping and knows if you're awake and knows if you've been bad or good, then maybe this isn't the best fit. So maybe that's one of the boundaries, that our liturgy is going to be human-focused and not focused on a personal intervening God. Well, maybe that's one of the boundaries. We can have a diversity of tastes when it comes to liturgical style. Some people like moments of silence. Some people hate moments of silence. Some people love responsive readings. Some people hate responsive readings with a white-hot passion because they feel like you're telling them what to say, and it's groupthink, and we're drones, and don't tell us. You can hear the vehemence, right? Some people like prose. Some people like poetry. They're just different.
I thought that the survey we sent out covered a lot of those kinds of topics. Do you want more music? Do you want less music? Do you want more Hebrew? Do you want less Hebrew?
And guess what? People are on both sides. So that's how it goes. We do have a diversity of political perspectives within a range.
Absolutely.
We're not going to support the anti-LGBTQ legislation or banning same-sex marriage or any of that. But, we can have economic liberals versus economic conservatives in the economic sense, obviously. People who are more concerned about deficits or less concerned about deficits, more in favor of social spending, less in favor of social spending. So we can have some diversity of political perspectives.
Social thought, I think, would be more.
But on social issues, we'll tend to agree. And also, your personal choices for Jewish connections. Some members choose to fast on Yom Kippur. Others don't get any meaning out of that, so they don't fast on Yom Kippur. We did have an interesting debate once about we have a great Onig reception after Rosh Hashanah. And both the evening and the morning service, we have food, people stay and they talk, and it's really wonderful for community building. So someone asked one year, can we do an Onig reception after the Yom Kippur services? And people said, well, I mean, that in theory, we're not opposed to that, and we're not forcing people to stay and eat, but some members do choose to not eat on that day, even if they drink water. I mean, they're doing their own style, but they're connecting in their own way. One person suggested we have an empty plate Oneg, like you have these empty plate banquets that people have for fundraisers, so you can sympathize with hunger.
I see.
And we could call it a no-neg instead of an Oneg. That was Irene Chase's joke. But in the end, we decided not to do it. But we have sometimes used that diversity as a motivation for people to be generous. So we'll say, we get to choose whether we fast or not for Yom Kippur, but other people are hungry all the time. And so let's be generous to them and do a food drive or some kind of collection around Yom Kippur. Even if you're choosing to eat or not, that's separate from people that don't get that choice. And we have some diversity on what kind of Jewish language we use and how much we use it. Some people will want lots of Hebrew, some people don't want any Hebrew, and you can find anything in between those two. And also on the issues related to Zionism and the state of Israel, we'll have a diversity of perspectives on that. Now, where are our boundaries? As I said, our liturgy is clearly humanistic. We would not impose traditional Jewish standards of dress on anybody. We just had a bat mitzvah this past weekend with totally bare shoulders, which is entirely up to the girl and her family's choice of aesthetic. We're not here to tell people what's modest and what's immodest. That's not the vocabulary that we use. We don't impose Jewish dietary laws on people. We clearly accept that Jewish sources, like the Torah, the Talmud, rabbinic law, are written by people. They were created by people. They have human authority, but not supernatural or permanent authority. And we celebrate diverse options. Other people will make choices about their lives, and we're allowed to make choices about our lives. So we wouldn't impose our choices on other people. Okay, so those are some of our boundaries. So how do we respond to the accusation that secular humanistic Judaism isn't really Jewish? So someone says to you, Kol Hadash isn't really Jewish, or that rabbi isn't really Jewish, or that humanistic Judaism, that isn't really Judaism. How might you respond to that kind of accusation?
Well, I mean,
seems Jewish to me.
It comes back to the question of definitions in a way. So if Judaism is defined as the religion, then in some sense we're not, because we don't practice those things. We're not God-centric. But if in terms of being Jewish, and if you look at Jewish as a culture and as a heritage and all that, and all of that thing, then it certainly is Jewish. But is it Judaism? I'm not sure. Honestly, even myself, I'm not sure.
So
the conversation we had last.
Yes, right. So you could just list the things we do that are Jewish.
Yeah.
Let's see. You want to see if it's Jewish? Does it walk like Jewish and quack like Jewish?
Yeah.
Right. So we have Shabbat services. We have high holiday services. We have a Passover Seder. We teach our kids Hebrew in Sunday school. We celebrate all these holidays. We study Jewish history. We learn Jewish literature. We play Jewish music. We have a Jewish choir that sings Jewish songs. You could just list all the items we do, and it quacks Jewish to me. I mean, it seems pretty Jewish in content. Also, you could point out who deputized you to define what counts as Jewish. There's no one person that defines. I mean, the Orthodox Jews tell Reform Jews that they're not doing Judaism. And, so we're not in the business of kicking people out of what's already a small community.
I think you said something some time ago that I think is very relevant, which is, you know, we look at the Bible as a book where God is a literary figure, that in a book that's written by people.
Right.
And all those people were Jews, and they wrote this book, and with everything that's in it. So how does that not make us, you know, how does that exclude us because they, you know?
Right.
That makes sense.
To be honest, it would have been a lot easier for us to just say, forget this Jewish thing and go out and be humanists and be secular people in the broader world.
Yeah, but
we're fighting for this
identity.
Fun.
Yeah,
right. We're working at this, and we actually probably spend more time thinking about what we've chosen to do or not to do than other people who are more easily accepted as Jewish. I'll also point out, famous Jews are claimed as Jewish, and you have no idea what they believe. You don't know if they're religious or not, or if they believe in God or not, or if they keep kosher or not. It's irrelevant to the Jewishness of Adam Sandler or Amy Schumer or Larry David or any of these figures.
Well, if you're, from an anthropological point of view, if you say secular humanistic Judaism you're not Jewish, you're abandoning the idea of culture altogether as
right.
something that can form the way you think and how you do and all that kind of stuff. I mean, culture, usually, when you talk about culture, you usually include religion, but it doesn't have to.
Right.
Right.
I'd also add that historically there's always been diversity of Jewish practice and belief. You've got idolatrous Jews and monolatrous Jews, and you've got multi-shrine Jews and Jerusalem-only Jews, and you've got the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes, and in the end of the Second Temple period, you've got the Karaites and the Rabbinites and the Jewish mystics and the Jewish rationalists and the Reform and the Orthodox.
And two different Talmuds.
Yeah, two different Talmuds and two different geography. I mean, there's always been diverse Jewish practices, and look at the difference from the killing of animals to sacrifice to a god in Jerusalem and the 19th century Reformed Jewish practice of people in pews with a pipe organ playing. I mean, these are radically different, but they both claim that label of Jewish. So we are, again, part of that spectrum of diverse Jewish practice. You know, what makes the language of Yiddish Jewish? Jews did it. It was a language in which Jews lived.
Yeah, Jews created the language and they used it.
And they use it, right. So we're part of that tradition of Jewish culture, more broadly understood. Okay, now, in that spirit, let's look at number 4. This is our last one. What limitations does secular humanistic Judaism have in addressing Jewish tradition and culture? And what strengths does this approach have? So what are some of our limitations?
Well, we don't do a lot of forms of things. I mean, we don't say the Shema, we don't take the religious things at face value and just and recite them because they are meaningless to us.
Right. So there is a sort of literacy gap because we're not reciting those same texts that everyone else has done. We actually, in our community, don't even do humanistic versions of some of those texts, where some other communities do a humanistic Shema, do a humanistic Hadash, because they want the parallel form, even if it's been sort of reworked. We've decided that it works for some people and doesn't work for other people, so we've decided not to push that envelope. If you are making your standard personal meaning, people choose to do different things. Well, sometimes it's hard to make a community out of that. You know, because different people are going to connect with different parts of Jewish life, and it's not going to work the same for everybody. And we restrict our choices based on this philosophic consistency approach. So certain Jewish poems we're not going to use because they're talking to a god and about a god, or we have to change them in a way that some people feel might do violence to the poem. And so it's a delicate balance that we have to strike because our lens through which we filter everything is humanism. Sometimes people in our communities don't know a lot about traditional Jewish life and practice, so other Jews assume they're lazy or assume they're ignorant and they just don't know, or you know they chose it because it's easier. Where sometimes it is a choice from knowledge, but sometimes it's a choice for positive values. You know, I pointed out to somebody, we sent our children to a dual language Spanish and English school, and for us that was a positive values choice. We want them to experience a diverse world out there. If we wanted them to only know Jewish things, we would have sent them to an only Jewish school. But diversity is a positive value. Knowing your neighbors, knowing people of different socioeconomic standards is important. We even chose a school that was more economically diverse because we wanted that experience too. So this is one of those cases where we have positive values that direct our choices sometimes away from Jewish-only choices, but that creates a challenge in exploring those Jewish connections. We don't emphasize a lot of Hebrew literacy. That means you're not reading the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew or understanding Israeli songs as you're singing them. We could emphasize Hebrew literacy and have adult learning classes for Hebrew and make it a primary focus, but we decide that history, philosophy, other issues are more relevant to our approach to Jewish life. And for many of our members, traditional Jewish life and practice is exotic anthropology rather than lived experience. It's, oh, those people out there, they keep kosher. What is that kosher practice and what's involved in that? Or what does it mean to not do work on Shabbat in an Orthodox home? I need a hidden camera expose of what this odd lifestyle is. And it's the exotic foreign as opposed to this is part of my cultural inheritance, because it's a very different experience to live your life that way. Now, the positive is that when we are making our choices, we are free to choose. We don't just have to do it because this is what our ancestors always did. And we are also able to draw from the wide range of Jewish cultural expressions. Ashkenazi, Sephardi. It's not only what my parents did, it's what the Jewish people created in all different cultures, and that can all be a way of connecting to my diverse peoplehood heritage. And I think most important is that we're able to recognize commonalities with other human cultures. Being Jewish is one way of being human and responding to the human experience. And it would be odd to say that the bar mitzvah, the bat mitzvah, or the b mitzvah in a gender-neutral term, has nothing whatsoever to do with any coming-of-age ceremony in any other culture. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, because every culture has this challenge of a coming-of-age ceremony. Cultures have ways of marking the transition in status. They have ways of marking new partnerships between two people. They have ways of marking a goodbye when somebody has died. And Jewish culture is one more expression of the human experience. And so if we can admit the parallels and see that Jewishness was made by people, then it has something in common with what other people do too. And that, I think, adds resonance to our Jewish observance, because we see the human wisdom in it. When somebody dies, there's a tradition of sitting Shiva, which is you stay in a home, traditionally for 7 days. The word Shiva is from the number Sheva, 7. You sit on a low stool, you cover mirrors, you wear torn clothing, you don't bathe, you don't shave if you're a man, or a woman for that matter. And you're supposed to adopt this attitude of sadness and mourning. Now, some of those things maybe have a psychological wisdom to them, some of them don't. Some of them are sort of, mea culpa, sort of causing suffering upon yourself. But the way the Shiva's evolved is, first of all, people rarely sit all 7 days these days. They'll say, I'm sitting Shiva for 2 days. Part of me laughs because I know the number basis to it, but I know what they mean. They'll have people over to the house, and people will bring them food. And they'll come and hug and cry and laugh and talk about the person who died and talk about what's happening in life and what next steps are. And the family feels supported by their community, by friends and neighbors, by their extended family that come in for the celebration of life. There's a psychological wisdom to stopping your life, to staying put in one place, to having people come to you, and to have that hole in your heart surrounded by other people. It doesn't fill the hole, but it distracts you enough and carries you and uplifts you enough that you get some comfort out of that experience. And then it's sometimes harder when the people leave, and then it's really quiet, and now you have to face the reality of what's there. But there's a psychological wisdom behind the tradition of Shiva that if we get rid of the covering the mirrors and the no shaving and some of that stuff, we can nevertheless appreciate that this insight into the human condition is valuable and it's ours, and that's why we do it.